and some other stuff. So, all right, we're very happy to have Lily Hsueh, who is an associate professor of economics and public policy at the School of Public Affairs at Arizona State University. She's also an affiliate scholar at the Woods Institute for Environment, Doerr School of Sustainability at Stanford. And she is an affiliate professor of the ASU Center for Environmental Economics and Sustainability Policy. Lily got her undergraduate degree from Berkeley, a master's degree in economics from University College of London, and a PhD in public policy and management from University of Washington. Prior to joining ASU, she was a National Research Council postdoc fellow at NOAA. And before that, she worked as a senior analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, where we intersected. And she authored the San Francisco Beige Book, which is a document that describes local economy for the FOMC meetings. She is a two-time recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award at ASU and the 2023 Professor of Impact Award recipient, which is a student-initiated award. And she was nominated for Outstanding Doctoral Mentor Award. So she's doing a lot of work with the students. She currently serves on the editorial board of PLOS Climate, which you guys know what it is. I don't have to explain. And is doing a lot of other things. And in the middle of all that, she has written a book, Corporations at Climate Crossroads, and she's going to share with us her insights.
Yeah, thank you so much, Glenda. It's such a pleasure to be here at Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz. I am a native of the Bay Area. I grew up in El Minden Valley, so just over the mountains from here. I brought a copy of my book that I'm happy to raffle off today. And so, thank you, Nanny. I'll get started, yeah. Well, I'm just really happy to be here and appreciate both Galinda and also Sandy for inviting me and for hosting me today. So I'm sharing my new book, Corporations at Climate Crossroads. And, you know, this is a book that took several years to, and then, you know, even through the pandemic for it to come together. In this book, I follow the world's largest companies by revenue. So the Global 500 and as well as the S&P 500, where I follow their climate action, climate pledges, as well as their environmental performance. And it's a large N quantitative analysis, coupled with illustrative cases where I look at individual companies and tell stories of this kind of the story of the past a decade and a half, nearly 2 decades of how corporations have been engaged in climate mitigation and climate adaptation as well. And so this path toward decarbonization, and that did not happen in a vacuum. And I'll tell you the framework where I'm looking at the bottom up and top down pressures and institutions and incentives of how all of that happened. And we may have an opportunity to talk a little bit about today the political headwinds and where I think corporations are going from here. So this is an interdisciplinary effort, and I really appreciate the interdisciplinary dialogue here at UC Santa Cruz as well. My book is published by MIT Press. It actually just came out in early September. It has been endorsed by leaders in economics, management, and political science, the various social sciences that shape climate policy. I'm one to believe that in terms of climate science, we are there. We know, you know, even without 100% certainty, the climate is warming, right? And this 2024 last year was the warmest year since recorded history. And yet, I think on the governance side, there needs to be more conversations across these social science disciplines that are talking about, you know, whether it's talking about the financing, the management, or the politics and the economics. And so that's where I come in. Just to give a little bit of context, global firms, so these are the multinational companies, the largest companies by revenue and market capitalization, they represent 70% of annual industrial emissions. And about 100 producers of fossil fuels are in fact responsible for this kind of burning of fossil fuels and emissions. On the kind of the policy and political economy side, in the last couple of years, so in 2023, for example, California mandated climate disclosure rules. And that, in fact, was already happening in the UK, in the European Union, New Zealand, India, Singapore, cities such as Hong Kong. And the US Securities Securities SEC also had proposed some rules that never went into effect. And so we are now seeing mandatory climate disclosure rules. Well, interestingly, companies worldwide have in fact been preparing for mandatory disclosure rules and much more, and have been engaged in proactive climate action and various pledges, net zero pledges for a long time. And that all of this has been happening in the past decade to 2 decades. And these are companies that ranges across sectors, from Target to Chevron to agricultural food buyers, from Walmart to Nestle to tech companies like Google and Microsoft, and to mining companies like Vale, based in Brazil. They've all been engaged in different proactive climate disclosures or climate actions. And also, there has been quite a bit of investments in clean energy. In fact, since 2016, investments in clean energy have outpaced investments in fossil fuels globally. Oh, can folks see the slides?
I'm not seeing them.
Okay, let me see. Is it being shared?
We can see them, Sandy.
I can-
Go to Lily's
I can-
view screen.
I know what it is.
Okay. Are we
Yeah.
okay? Okay, great. So my book's central questions are these three. What firm level and political economy factors drive corporate behavior and performance on climate change? Do firms that participate in these proactive pledges and actions and carbon management, sustainability, what I call outputs, really in fact emit less carbon emissions? And then is there variation across sectors in developed and versus developing countries? And I'm very interested in the firm level, plus the regulatory level, and also what's happening globally as well. And in this presentation today, I'm going to focus, I'll talk about the larger framework, but also then focus on this second question here, which is, again, do firms that participate in voluntary climate action emit less carbon emissions? So linking firm level sustainability outputs with that of outcomes and performance. So the big picture takeaways of the book. First of all, my core argument is that corporations just like the title demonstrates, at a climate crossroads, and they're shaped by bottom-up and top-down incentives and pressures and institutions. And together, I call that multi-level governance drivers of climate action by firms. And to kind of make this argument, I've proposed a strategic management framework of this nested structure of climate policy and climate change governance, involving the interplay between what's happening at the firm level, involving executive leadership, what's happening at the regulatory level, and also global governance level as well. And I do that by really trying to understand and opening the black box of the firm, looking at managerial agency. In that and preferences, what economists would call preferences, and how that interact with regulation and global governance. And so some of these political economy, external risks that firms face, and how together they lead to corporate climate action. In my book, I also spend quite a few chapters investigating greenwashing, evidence of greenwashing. And what I find is that actually sustainability pledges, these carbon management, adoption of emissions targets to setting a price on carbon, they're what I call sustainability outputs, do not necessarily, in fact, lead to reduced entity-wide carbon emissions, with that when there is no accountability, when there is either no regulatory pressure or even adherence rules and policies. And that said, all of this action and pledges and all of things that companies are doing, there does seem to be some evidence of reduced carbon emissions intensity by at least one measure, and which is positive and but in order for kind of more kind of a larger kind of entity-wide aggregate reductions, there certainly have to be accountability, and I'll go back to that. Yes. Either way, I'm happy either way.
Since I raised my hand.
Yes.
So one concern I always
Yes.
have with this correlation
Sure.
is that if I'm already greening for some other
Yes.
season, maybe I'm just happen to be upgrading my capital and choose the greener one.
Yes.
That makes it cheaper for me to join the sustainability pledge. So there could be some reverse causality.
Yes.
Are you able to address that statistically?
Yes, so I actually am able to address that statistically, and I will get back to that. So actually, let me let me here now talk about some of the methods, and then I will, and I'll come back to that. So I do that with a quasi experiment, and it is actually by exploiting policy. And in fact, the Obama era clean power plan, and I'll show you how I am able to do that. So this book is based on mixed methods research design. I'm a quantitative social scientist economist, and so I run a lot of regressions. But I'm for this, for when it comes to voluntary climate action, obviously there's a lot going on, right? And causal inference is not easy, but I do try attempt at that through quasi experiments, which I'll get back to. And I also run and engage in discrete continuous modeling. And what I mean by that is I'm attempting to differentiate between what economists call the extensive margins. So this binary decisions by firms of yes or no, are they going to be involved in a certain commitment or pledges, or to adopt a science-based target or not, and also how much effort. To what degree are they going to, in fact, engage in carbon disclosure? And is that going to the binary decision, is that going to actually lead to outcomes? And so to get back at your question, which I'll come back to too later, is that I run these triple differences in differences kind of quasi-experiment equations, and embedded in that is this endogenous binary discrete continuous modeling. So a lot is going on there, and I'll speak a little bit more about it in a little bit. In addition to the quantitative analysis, I also took part in observation, where I attended these large industry-driven conferences, where a big industry-driven sustainability conference is what used to be called the Green Biz, which a lot of those folks who are in this domain would know that Green Biz takes place every year in Phoenix, and I had an opportunity to sit in on a lot of the meetings, and met a lot of stakeholders, including UN Global Compact stakeholders, and attended the Sustainable Development Goal and Innovation Accelerator workshops run by these UN groups, as well as engage in systematic interviews with company managers and sustainability leaders, regulators, and also global governance leaders. So in addition to the large N analysis, I have these illustrative case studies to try to get at some of the narratives and stories to trace causal mechanisms. And cases in the book include a case on Adidas, Moody's, Intel, Microsoft. I take a look at the oil and gas climate initiative as well. And then let me speak briefly about the various insights from economics, political science, and management on corporate environmentalism, essentially corporate self-regulation, or what economists in the economics literature call the private provision of public goods literature. And so so economists and management scholars tend to focus more on what's happening either at the market level or the firm level. And then so lessons that I have learned in this literature is this idea that, well, there is imperfect and asymmetric information between firms, regulators, and stakeholders. And companies will engage in proactive climate action or self-regulation in general to deflect private politics or activism, also public politics, which is regulations and laws. And they, of course, will also respond to consumer demand and what's happening in the market as well. And I try to control for that with data on energy prices and other methods as well. But here I'm really kind of focused on what companies are doing in terms of their interactions with regulators and that they are firms with their profit maximizers, but with a broader set of attitudes and calculations. They will preempt regulation. They will preempt activism, and they do that through various ways, including climate action. And what I take from the political science literature is this idea of private authority, and that there is this transnational climate governance with a lot of various actors, from countries to even at the kind of transnational levels with these non-governmental organizations or international organizations, where they all have their various authorities and agendas trying to pressure companies to act and there are also NGOs that deflect or trying to get companies to do good, or sometimes maybe not to do good either. But this idea that firms are kind of governors, they have the authority, and they then and govern, and also at the country level, regulators may even delegate to firms to do what they are themselves not doing for various reasons, including whether their constituencies are engaged in or even believe that climate change exists. And then, the collective action. And so together, I bring together various literatures to really try to understand how corporations are, the various pressures and incentives and whatnot. And what is missing, I think, is what's happening at the firm level. And I'm going to try to open that black box by looking at managerial agency and then making that connection to the regulatory and global levels. So I reach into the organizational behavior and strategic management literature in terms of understanding what's happening with these firm level leaders. Well, managers perform 3 tasks. They attract climate neutral and climate conscious employees. Then they try to align beliefs of employees with that of the firm. And then they form governing coalitions comprised of internal stakeholders across levels. So both with employees from just the analyst level all the way to the CEO and to the boards of directors. And managers facilitate incentives and coordinate activities. And they even shape narratives. And so, under uncertainty of climate change, companies, while private profit maximizers, they're willing to as part of their risk management, be more open-minded and allow, and they do. And what I've seen at the firm level with in the data and also in the interviews is that they're willing for these executive leaders, whether it's the chief sustainability officers or the CEOs, to take part in trying to drive firms toward climate action. And firms are carriers of identity and reputation, and they may even there are employees, especially in this new generation, where they care about what the firms represent.
A small
Yes.
question about your slide.
Sure.
Managers perform 3 tasks.
Yes.
And number 1 is interesting because
Yes.
you say climate neutral or conscious.
Yes.
You didn't use anything that was negative,
Yes.
but were you deliberately choosing 0 or plus and excluding minus? And
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
did you do that?
Yes. It is a deliberate choice. I imagine, and then verified with conversations, is that if there are employees that are climate negative, they are not necessarily going to be on board. They may, as a spillover.
I'm just wondering,
yeah.
is that a force inside these companies, though, that also needs to be reckoned with?
Yes, I hear you. And I think that may come through the governing coalitions. Once you have that collective action within companies, and their evidence, like in my when I have Adidas, I'll come to that case where there are opportunities where where these sustainability officers are able to get employees and get other champions within the firm at all various levels. They then reach out to even greater parts of the companies, where maybe initially it's the committed, but eventually it will have ripple effects and spillover effects.
In this slide, the managers in question are sustainability managers.
Yes, they're
designated by the company to move these efforts forward.
Yes.
And we haven't talked here in this slide about all the other people.
No, yes, you're right. This is about the manager, I would say the senior to executive level managers who are increasingly hired in firms. Oh, here, so let me show you some data on this. So the senior executive managers responsible for climate mitigation is on a steady rise. So I have here data from 2011 to 2020 and of developed and developing countries. So, this high trend of, from even in 2011, in developed countries were about a little bit over 50%. And we're seeing now essentially, 80 to 90% of global companies, these multinationals all have these senior or executive level managers just focus on climate. And we're seeing how that's a trend that developing countries also trending up, with India and Brazil leading the way. And we're seeing that also, you're seeing that also in, China and Russia as well, and a really steep incline of what's happening within Chinese firms. There's evidence of a lot of these actually consulting firms on the web, like in Europe and America, where they're targeting these Chinese firms and helping to consult and so yes, China is now leading. It appears in a lot of decarbonization, but in fact, a lot of that actually is driven by what had happened here in the U.S. and in Europe as well. Let's see. Oops. I'll come back to this in a bit. So let me speak a little bit about my multi-level governance framework on climate change. So I have adapted an inverted Elinor Ostrom's nested structure of institutions Eleanor Ostrom, a political scientist by training, but in fact won the Nobel Prize in economic science a couple years ago, or several years ago now. And a lot of her work is looking at is private provisions of public goods, or this idea of private initiatives, and how private entities can themselves, or private communities, so both, more formal to grazing, communities and agricultural communities, where they can come together in collective action, and they know best what their pressure points are and their resources, and then be able to benefit the larger environment or climate. And so what I've done is, she talks about this nested structure of governance, kind of a polycentric framework. And what I've done here is kind of inverted, where I have the operational level or corporate governance level at the bottom, and then the collective choice or regulatory governance, and at the very high level is the constitutional global governance level. And what I do in my book, in chapter 2, is I theorize about that interaction. And I say that managers are regulation brokers. They facilitate voluntary climate action preemptively. They engage in corporate self-regulation on behalf of the firm to safeguard reputations and to avoid costly liabilities. So that's at the corporate level. So here you see this agency versus, now bridged with institutions and regulation. And then at the corporate level, at the global level, managers are norm brokers. They're the ones attending green biz and sustainability conferences, and I met many of them, and where they represent their companies to contest and shape and translate and help to disseminate some of these global best practices. So there is indeed this learning that takes place, and then they are helped to then shape market best practices down now or down the line. The assumption I make here is that global governance institutions are a harbinger of future regulations, and that's why it matters. And so there is this cost cost consideration, or this consideration of that's more, kind of profit motive too, where, well, they're not just attending any global institution or forums. They're actually there because they want to know what's ahead, especially when it comes to managing uncertainty and risks. But ultimately, what I say and write in my and try to show in my book is that the learning and norming, they're attenuated by regulatory pressure, or at the domestic level, whether it's kind of federal national law or even state or local laws, is that they lead the way. Eventually there will, what will happening, that interaction between regulation and global governance really does matter, because, and having stringent or more stringent rules matter. Otherwise, they're just gonna, what firms are learning and doing at the global level will really lead to minor adjustments, because their benchmark, their expectations comes from what's happening at the domestic level. And so here, together, I have in chapter 2, I have these propositions that then I test and show empirically through data, and also through illustrative cases in the rest of the book. And just to be a little bit more concrete before I go and answer the second question of linking sustainability outputs to outcomes, is let me tell you the story of Adidas. And I've had the opportunity to interview many leaders within Adidas. So at the managerial and organizational level, starting in 2005, Adidas started a unit within the company called green company. It is now the workplace and governance unit. And it was at that time in 2005 sponsored by Adidas chief executive officer. So from the get-go, there was buy-in from its chief CEO. Initially, this is true of many companies, whether in kind of the retail apparel sector or even tech, the initial focus was on energy efficiency, paper and water recycling. And then within 10 years, a decade later, they started to standardize and track and report targets and outcomes. And in fact, it was around that time they were recognized by the UN as a leader in quotes, measure, reduce, and contribute. They instituted green teams across all its global sites. And these green teams had access to incentives called green funds to spend on sustainability projects. And this is where what I was saying earlier, where those governing coalitions, where now different folks around in the company, from kind of just analysts to managers, where they're all part of this, and then as a and then they're leading the way and over time embedding these sustainability into the company. So this is kind of at a managerial organizational level, and as a German company, so now I'm talking about the corporate and regulation interaction, Adidas face more regulatory pressure, from their country of domicile, right? That's where they're based in Germany, they have had to report Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, or direct and easy indirect emissions early on, and increasingly they now have to report Scope 3 emissions. And today they have about 20% reduction. And so they are responding to what's happening at the regulatory level, and then they adapt and exceed local infrastructure and regulations when possible.
To date?
Yes.
20% since when?
To date, I think it was, I have to,
2015 or?
Yeah, I think it was like 2015 or so, and I'll have to check on that, but I believe it's since 2015 as the baseline. And so that one, Adidas told me this, but I was also told this by other companies, from Microsoft, Intel, and others, where when they have these sustainability initiatives and targets and whatnot, they want to avoid patchwork redundancies and costs. And so as much as possible, they do try to deploy what they do worldwide. And so this is where, again, kind of what's happening at the country level or the domestic level matters, because then with that as a benchmark, companies will then, to avoid kind of catch up later and cost effects later, they will try to kind of deploy globally. But of course, and in doing so, they may exceed local regulations and infrastructure. And then as part of their marketing, they own the game. Strategy is what they were told me. And then, branding is also part of that. So they're really a lot of what's happening kind of at the, managerial, organizational level to the regulatory level, then feeds into their marketing. For the places we play, without a beautiful planet, there is no beautiful game. And they are one of the first to really use ocean plastic in their shoemaking, and then they're a founding member of over 20 plus global governance collaborations. This is not to say that there hasn't been any pushback. In Germany, there has been several lawsuits, actually, complaining that Adidas is not doing more or not doing enough, or shortcutting on their 2030 targets. So, but at kind of at a larger kind of global level, they are ahead of many companies, and I am in my book able to show, they're just one end of a panel data that I'm able to analyze of companies of at the organizational level, and what how would that interact with regulation and global governance. Another feature of the book is where I'm going to get to linking that sustainability output to outcome, is that I want to know whether these drivers, these cross-level governance drivers, how that drive companies' decisions about outputs, so climate disclosures, reduction targets, and even setting an internal price on carbon, how that then leads to performance, and at high level versus low level. I measure the intensity of participation or effort as well. And I'll get back to some of this in a bit. So in this next part of my talk, I'm going to answer this question: do firms that participate in voluntary carbon disclosure emit less carbon emissions? So now I will get to a very concrete case of firms' voluntary carbon disclosures. Carbon Disclosure Project, now called the CDP, has since 2000, so it's now been 25 years, where they have, on behalf of institutional investors, survey global companies and some medium-sized companies as well about their governance, their strategy, risk management, adoptions of targets, and also entity-wide carbon emissions. What I do quantitatively here to try to get at that this firm's varying levels of effort is that I exploit the fact that CDP grades firms on low to high levels of carbon disclosure. So if a company responds to the survey and participate in just carbon disclosure, then it gets the letter grade D for basic carbon transparency, and it can then get grades A, B, C up. So from D, it can also get A, B, and C, and at the highest level, firms can be graded A for having third-party audits of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. I think for this group, folks know the difference between the various scopes of emissions. So Scope 1 being direct emissions coming from companies' facilities, from their vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect, coming from the power, the purchased electricity and steam and heating and cooling of companies. And Scope 3 is the emissions in the value chain or supply chain. So here is just to get back to the various disclosure levels of the CDP that the CDP grades on. So to be even more specific, you see here where firms can also be graded B at the management level, where there is action. The companies are taking action based on results from assessments. So whether they have taken action in terms of the adopting a science-based emissions targets or even or environmental management system. So those are what I will then call carbon management sustainability outputs. And by showing awareness, so even initial assessments of business impacts, where there are just doing some of those basic assessments, they can get a grade C. And again, just attempting to answer the question, companies can get a grade D. And I want to show a result, and I can come back. Actually, I actually have slides that I can pull up on my models, and I think that might actually be helpful later to when I answer questions. But let me show you some high level results right now. So one main result I find is that as a disclosing firm increases in size, it reduces carbon emissions on a per employee basis. So this is one of my measure of carbon emissions intensity, which is to denominate carbon emissions by the number of employees. So that's one measure of firm size. I also do that by revenue. So essentially, I have two main measures of carbon emissions intensity, by revenue and by per employee basis. And what I show is that firms that have that this is S&P 500 companies, so companies based in the U.S. but operating worldwide. They have in disclosing to the Carbon Disclosure Project that this disclosure is correlated with firms' emissions intensity reductions. Yes.
Could you explain what the slide plots?
Yes. So this is essentially saying that I'm making a kind of the marginal doing a marginal analysis. So when companies, on average, when they are disclosing on an annual basis to the CDP, it's correlated with a 16% reduction in their carbon emissions intensity. And so for participating firms, I'm able to kind of see this this correlation, and I will show you in a bit, and I'll come to this, is that because I'm able to see both the extensive margins of when companies make the decision to participate or not, and also their effort, what I am able to see is that for the greenhouse gas intensive companies, so these are the power plants and utilities and the intensive carbon intensive companies, they are actually participating less under regulatory pressures, but those who do disclose are reducing their carbon emissions. And so I'm able to, and I interact in my regressions, I interact that with whether firms have an executive level, senior level managers or not. So I'm also able to, I take into account that variation. Yeah.
So just on the specifics
Sure.
of the slide. So the main result is
Yes.
the green bar minus 16%.
Yes.
And then it looks like an error bar.
Oh yes. So the error bar is that shows that to some we reduce even more, but then there are ones that reduce less, but it's never, it's within it's after the 0%. So all of them are yeah.
So it's not
on
really
average.
an error bar, it's a range of plus some percent and minus some percent.
Yeah, in that, it's the 95% confidence
95%,
interval.
okay.
Yeah. So
Very good.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And so how do I get at the causal inference? And I try to do that by exploiting the fact that in the past several decades, there have been failed climate change legislation proposals in the US Congress. All these various laws may have been introduced either by Senate or in the Senate or in the House, but they don't go anywhere. And so when the EPA introduced the Clean Power Plan, and that was during the Obama era, when there was this opening of more climate friendly, and the Obama's executive initiative or executive order on the EPA for the introduction of the Clean Power Plan, and that was this was a section 111D of the Clean Air Act, and that the EPA was able to do that thanks to the two big kind of developments. One was the Supreme Court in 2007, where they ruled that the Clean Air Act encompasses greenhouse gas emissions, and the second, which is the endangerment findings, which I know is being pulled and dismantled. But that was which stated that the greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, endangered public health. And so those two, I argue, and this is chapter 5 where I make this argument, is that the introduction of the Clean Power Plan was interpreted by companies and those who I talked to and in the data I see, it was credible. While it did not become law and later on lots of lawsuits and whatnot, it was regulatory pressure and companies acted based on that. And I showed that through statistical tests as well, which you can find in the appendix as well. And to show you some data, so here is participation rate in the CDP. This is again the S&P 500 companies, managers, those with executive level and senior level managers, and those without. What we see is that those without any managerial leadership, their participation rates, whether it's a greenhouse gas intensive company or sector or a consumer oriented sector, their participation in the CDP or in carbon disclosure, it's much lower. And on those with managers, the participation rate is quite high, over 75%. And for the consumer oriented companies, it's even higher. And what's interesting here is that you see for the greenhouse gas intensive companies, which is the blue dotted line, is that during the Clean Power Plan, when it was being viewed right before and right after its introduction, being viewed as a credible regulatory threat, those with managers in the greenhouse gas intensive sector actually participated less. And this is where managers are making decisions, right? It's not necessarily all let's go forward. Maybe there are some, if we don't have good news to share, and there's some evidence in the literature. So Tom Lyon over at University of Michigan Sustainability School and Business School, he has shown that when looking at greenwashing behavior, when there's no good news to share, there could potentially be pullback. And of course, we're also seeing the consumer-oriented sectors are it could be branding. It's like they're visible, right? They're the retailers and others where they're readily engaged in these various carbon disclosure efforts. And we'll see soon that I'm going to show you some results where some of that does appear to be kind of potentially just window dressing. Of course, they are also the less carbon intensive companies. So the ones we really care about is the large carbon footprint sector. So for greenhouse gas intensive firms, and so these are the companies that utilities, power plants, but even beyond that in energy and industrials, where they interpreted the Clean Power Plan to have regulatory pressure. So even those who were not directly targeted still felt the pressure that something was, this was before Trump. So there was interpretation that this Clean Power Plan is actually a harbinger of something much more, and with the Paris Agreement in the horizon, and also even post that, before Trump's first election, there was a time when there was a lot of conversations across countries at the global level where companies really felt that pressure, and especially the carbon intensive firms. Well, what I see in the data in my regression results is that they reduce carbon emissions at the entity-wide level. So this is more absolute levels, not just the intensity measures. And this here it's about 5%, negative 5% of that reduction. Interestingly, is that the consumer-oriented firms, those who got letter grade A and B leadership, and kind of was even publicized by the CDP for being leaders, there were some perverse results. They installed carbon management plans, and they made a lot of pledges, and yet they were associated with increases in the entity-wide emissions. And when I take a closer look, well, A-list firms are not greenwashing proof. And part of that is actually in the design of the Carbon Disclosure Project, the CDP, because these grading was not based on performance, or it's all about output, sustainability outputs. It's what they, it's about whether, you disclose the fact that you have self-reported, that you have instituted a carbon emissions target. You have set a price, or even set a price on carbon, or a lot of these other sustainability related pledges. But it was never about the measure of performance. And so companies like Walmart, Target, and Nike, they received grade in the B to A minus range. Well, some of them, or these in particular, were part of an industry-led Cascel, or it was formerly called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, where there were some deceptive greenwashing behavior where they portrayed petroleum-based synthetics as a more sustainable choice. And they did so even through their this index that, as a collective, that they produced, what's called the Higgs index. There's since been some modifications to this index, but in the period which I studied, was between 2010 to 2020. This was documented to have taken place. And Walmart, while a leader in many ways, and certainly in recent years in their supply chain efforts, they were sued by FTC when they had described bamboo products as eco-friendly and sustainable, when in fact the bamboo product was made from semi-synthetic fiber. So there are these somewhat misleading kind of almost this race to window dress, or to show climate friendly behavior when in fact it wasn't necessarily quite so. This leads to toward the end of my kind of presentation, is that what happens when markets or even when governments fail, right? Accountability metrics that measures ESG, environmental, social, and governance scores on corporate behavior, when adjusted for bad media or political interference, anti-competitiveness, is about 5 to 10 percentage lower. The adjusted measures of 5 to 10 percentage points lower than the standard ESG measure. And so in fact, there are these global businesses. There are these kind of at times deceptive behavior that we need to kind of keep a tab on and keep them accountable. And of course, in today's political climate, we're going to see oil and gas companies investing in new drilling, and they have their net zero emissions goals, and they are investing heavily in climate tech, in clean tech, and a lot of that involves AI as well. But there's still, I think, these multi-governance pressure points along the way, whether it's at the firm level, where we are seeing companies that can continue to integrate ESG for investors and to engage with suppliers. And what's interesting, so in terms of just to get back to earlier quick mention of the endangerment findings, during the period when there was open forum for companies to comment on the Trump's removal of endangerment findings, the Business Roundtable, which is made up of all sorts of global 500 or S&P 500 companies, the one message, so there are these companies with varying efforts of climate action. One message was clear, was that they wanted stable regulations and consistent regulations. What that looked like, obviously many of them disagree, but they didn't really want it to have to contend with 50 different regulations coming from local and state governments, right? For those of us governance and scholars and economists, we're like, well, actually, these kind of state level policy laboratories, let's see which one, what are the best policies. But companies are like, well, no, we want stable, and if harmonized would even be better. And we are seeing subnational government leadership at the global governance level. There's even city level kind of networks where city governors and governments are coming together to put pressure on companies. The International Court of Justice advisory opinion just this back in July. Really, with it's an advisory opinion, but ultimately could affect, lawsuits, right? And keep countries, and also corporations accountable. And then also, though, and also at this kind of pressure from stakeholders, in my book in chapter 10, I feature the Stanford Coalition for True School of Sustainability, this university fossil fuel dissociation movement. And that is something that's in the horizon as well, as more young people and youth are coming together to make their statements heard and to really demand for a safer and more sustainable planet and future. And so these are all the various multi-level kind of pressure points and incentives and policies that are still that still exists even with national level political headwinds here in the US. I'm happy to talk more about any of the various topics that I brought up today. So to end, my big picture takeaway is, well, to navigate uncertainty, corporate responses to the climate challenge is really this interplay of internal firm leadership, what's happening internally, organizationally, what there may be complementary business capabilities, and strategic and proactive engagement that companies are doing at the regulatory process, with the regulatory process and global governance. To end, here are two QR codes where you can get to the open access edition of the book, or there's also a discount code if you want to buy a copy of the book. So, thank you. Yes.
2 slides ago, you on the bottom you had the university's role
Yes.
in divesting from fossil fuels, and within sort of university activist groups,
Yeah.
like you hear of divest from fossil fuels,
Yes.
and you hear of dirty banks.
Yes.
Is there a list of dirty companies, and should we also be talking about companies that have boycotted, or do you think?
That's a really interesting and important point. So I had reviewed a book on climate shaming a couple years ago, and this legal scholar, essentially the bottom line with her message is, yes, there should be climate shaming, and these lists of bad firms should be should be made public. Others may take, and I would probably count myself as one of them, where I take a different view. I actually believe that it should be companies that are the best players, the ones that are doing the most, should be applauded, and should that ranking should be publicly available, which we do see them, and there's various indices and also rankings showing that. And but yeah, I mean, I think that is a strategy. And it is a strategy that can work. That said, I tend to kind of would probably advocate for more positive reinforcement. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh,
Three.
Well, this is, I'm probably getting ahead of myself. Thank you. First of all, thank you. It was wonderful. And I was screenshotting your slides, and I have to go back and digest them. And I'm just so thrilled the book is open access. So hats off to you about that. That just is so wonderful. Anyway, so my question, this is the getting ahead of myself, but it actually, Alexi would approve. It kind of builds on what Alexi just asked. So this is maybe, Lily, your next book. I know you always are looking for new possibilities. So you said in this slideshow, you talked about the importance of senior level managers interested in or responsible for climate mitigation. And then you showed that companies that have those senior level managers or a high level of managerial participation is key for participation in carbon disclosure programs. So we know it works. We know it's a good thing. And it's right. Okay. So what about the university as a corporation, which everybody talks about, right? The corporate university. It's got a corporate managerial structure. It's got a client base. It faces certain regulations. It has to make investment decisions. There are accountability structures, like even specifically for sustainability, like ASHRAE, whatever it is, the Association for Advancement and Sustainability in Higher Education. All right. So given what you've just shown works for corporations, wouldn't it be a good idea for universities to have, as a general rule, a senior level manager responsible for responding and coordinating climate mitigation, climate activities, climate research, climate?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I probably would. And in fact, actually, many universities, starting with some of the elite universities like Harvard, Princeton, and I just recently met University of Pennsylvania's vice provost on climate. She's actually an energy policy scholar. And so yeah, I think universities are starting to have these kind of leaders doing these various things. One point I would add, and I want to make sure that that I do underscore, is that at the participation or that extensive level of pledges and participation and whatnot, yes, these managers are definitely are having an effect, and there's there's a proliferation, basically a lot going on. That said, for the effort level or the intensive margins, and then down the line performance, it requires more than that, right? It requires these other more kind of fine-grained accountability mechanisms. And that's where, whether it's for universities, nonprofits, or companies, we need to have those and policies too that kind of tie outputs to outcomes. But yeah, thank you so much. I agree.
Well said. Thank you very much. It's great.
And oh yes, and I also see Sandy and also Galina as well. So yes, I'll go. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I have two questions. Before I do the questions, I noticed the voice of Professor Arthur that just spoke. Hello, Professor Arthur. It's been a year, but it's good to hear your voice. I was wondering if we could go back to the slide that was talking about the 3 roles of the manager. I just had a question about point 2, where it was talking about.
Let me see. Oh, wait.
Maybe we don't necessarily have to do that. I remember.
But let me.
Yes.
Yeah.
When it says align the beliefs of employee with the firm, does that mean like crush their carbon consciousness, or does that mean like make it so that their climate consciousness aligns with ways that would make the company more money or make them look bad?
I think it could be both. And I am actually agnostic about exactly how that mechanism happens. But one thing I would say is that a lot of business schools and also even schools, sustainability and policy schools, are increasingly having these specialized programs where they are training sustainability officers. And those who self-select into these programs are climate conscious. They're the ones who they have these values. And yet at the same time, so the students I spoke to when I presented this at the Harvard Business School, the MBAs, they are the climate conscious students, but they're also about value, about the financial value, the cost effectiveness. And in fact, actually, I went into economics and environmental economics in particular because I want to protect the planet cost effectively, right? And so a lot of these managers they have these values of climate consciousness, but they're also thinking about how can we reduce costs and be cost effective in doing so. And they might, and one way that I show in the book, and I don't think I probably did enough, I didn't have enough time to talk about it, is that one of the ways they do that is look at what are business, some adjacent complementarities within the firm. And then from there, leverage to do more climate related initiatives. So for example, I'll just have a concrete example. In fact, I actually started the book talking about this case of Intel. Intel for many years in semiconductors, they actually got a lot of bad press for toxic, for the chemicals they use in its semiconductor process. It's not a clean room. It's actually a very, toxic chemical manufacturing process. And so they were forced for years ago, more than 30 years ago, to be involved in trying to be more sustainable with different clean chemical initiatives. And so the managers that I spoke to and interviewed, they said that they were able to kind of, in fact, pivot from what they were doing with green chemistry. And they were already, measuring and had a process, environmental management system around that, and then pivot that to some of the carbon management processes they were doing. And also even with their exact copy with the personal computers, their whole the idea of one operating system that can be kind of harmonized across different and circuitry ICs being harmonized across various business products. They were using some of those same structures to then pivot to climate related and renewable energy related projects. And so these managers are aligning beliefs of employees with firms both ways. They're taking into account what employees are doing, and saying and wanting to retain them as talents, and increasingly as part of workforce, or a lot of the environmental initiatives are part of the workforce and governance units within firms. But they're also real, I think, communicating and letting the employees know hey, our company is doing XYZ. These are ways where we can make money and be more efficient and protect the climate. The planet and in that way. So I see there's the synergies that are required really kind of digging in and talking and understanding what's happening within the firm to have seen some of those dynamics. Yes, please, Sandy, and then Phil.
So supposing we stand back for a sec, and you gave us some numbers. One was minus 16%, one was minus 5, one was plus 4, and one was plus 3.
Yes.
So they're not large.
Yeah.
Either way.
Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. That was a particular study for firms that were obeying or adhering to the CDP protocols.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other studies in the book that select companies in a different way that yield responses that are bigger?
So what I do is when I run these various kind of models and regressions, I have a lot of what we call robustness checks and sensitivity analysis. And I would say in general, that's those, they cohere, or they,
kind of typical?
Yeah, they're typical. And then where you see that 95% confidence level, that's essentially,
Okay.
Yeah.
So from 35,000 feet, you're reviewing over a decade of talk, maybe more. And this is the response.
Yes.
So maybe this is an unfair question. Are you satisfied with the responses that we're seeing in corporations to the climate threat?
Okay, so I would say that I am not surprised. This is almost, in some ways, this is where we're at the end of a decade to 2 decades of where companies are doing these voluntary efforts, and where the bar is not very high. The CDP is not about performance. It's about carbon management. So and there's some literature that my political science colleagues are engaged in where they are like, well, this, all of this, what's happening is not a bad thing, but there's these positive spillover effects. We're getting everyone on board. I think the next phase, which is where I hope I ended my book this way, and I think I tried to, is that the accountability, that the next phase is really like, well, let's move companies from just these outputs to actually performing and carbon footprints. And
Okay,
yeah.
so just one
Yeah.
closing question.
Sure.
Do you see the seeds of that in the companies themselves, in your interviews and so on? Do you think they will, without further flogging from the outside, move satisfactorily in that direction? Or do you think that transformation really won't happen effectively unless there's some kind of external pressure
Yes.
that's harder, more forceful than what we've done so far?
Thank you for that question. So I would say maybe my short answer would be yes, an external force or external pressures are important, but my framework is more nuanced in the sense of where the bottom up is important as well, and it is this kind of dynamic system where individual kind of like companies and also leaders are doing something and doing more, but it does require collective action, which happens ultimately at the policy level. Yeah.
And policy is
And policy,
government?
it's a government, or it could even be an international NGO that has a little bit more, legitimacy. So recently, I think within the last week and a half, the International Standardization Organization, ISO, they just announced that there is forthcoming standards for net zero pledges. So that's actually a privately, has stakeholders, many stakeholders, including regulatory bodies, but it is essentially kind of a international NGO that's private. So not driven by any domestic regulation per se. So that can happen, but it does I do think these external pressures matter, and then it has that interaction effect though with leaders within, where they need that, and they at the very least need baseline to work with to then do more. Right. And so and whether they do more or not depends on their own kind of costs, their cost functions, right? And this is where I am. I do believe in these kind of cap and trade programs, where there's some efficiency gains where then, those who can and know best how to do it right away can then do it, and then other firms can buy into it in some way through permits or whatnot. I mean, just kind of largely, not talking about anything specific, but we do know that SO2 market worked really well in Southern California, for example, right? And so less, and also cat shares. I was a postdoc at NOAA, where a lot of the cap and trade like permitting programs within sustainable fisheries also has been very effective. Oh yes, sorry. Good.
Yeah, so I think at some point that circle closes, right? Because the consumer pressure does affect politics and things like that. The government so, but I wanted to go back to like the climate shaming, climate shaming question, and I think it's also more general about your work that we tend to think in the analysis the firm, like an economic model, firm is producing good, but you are looking at very large corporations, which tend to be vertically integrated and also owning multiple brands, right? And so there could be like a lot of greening activities actually done by the dirtiest companies, right? I mean, some of it is greenwashing, like Shell is telling you they're using so much renewable doesn't mean clean, by the way.
Yes, exactly.
Biodiesel that they're using, not salt. But so how do I think about that, right? Like, so you know, on one hand, I don't want to support the bad guys.
Yes.
On the other hand, I kind of have to work with them because they produce my electricity. I can't just like, I cannot disconnect from PG&E,
Yes.
no matter what they do, right? And so, you know, what are the levers? And then, of course, the same guys that
Yeah.
have the political
Yeah.
power. So how do you think about that internal
Yeah.
complexity of corporations when you think
Yeah.
about those issues?
No, that's a really good question and a challenging one. I don't know that I have, the answer, but I feel like earlier in our panel, I had talked about Walmart. I think that is actually Walmart as an example is uh, illustrative here because Walmart is the largest single buyer in the world, right? And it has a lot of suppliers. And so the supply chain, I think, is also the next step. The first step was getting everyone on board. And so all sorts of pledges, whatever. Next step of accountability will also supply chain accountability. And where like a large or where like important buyers with scale, if they can get their suppliers to do more. And then, it could be, I hear what you were saying about the vertically integrated firm, but it's the same idea. If they can get down, kind of the downstream units or, or suppliers to comply in some way with incentives. And I can see how it could be done, with scale even. But it is but I do think scope 3 emissions is where, a lot of companies like Adidas, I think like 80%, at least 80% is scope 3. Right. So they're now very lean. It's one of my examples of the very, lean and efficient and green, but that's 20% of their operation, of their operational emissions, right? It's the scope 3 we have to pay attention to.
Because you can dig up the coal very clean.
Yeah.
Right, but then somebody downstream is gonna burn it.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the million-dollar question right now is about the scope 3 and the downstream. I think people are starting to. I don't have access. I don't personally have seen the data. I want access to it though. Yeah, because I think that's where we need attention on. And Walmart with their project Gigaton able to even within 6 years early meet their goal through suppliers and it was even I believe a voluntary supplier program where and it was I think 6,000 suppliers that helped them. I mean, there were some headline suppliers like Coca-Cola, Samsung, and others that did a lot, but there were many of them that were much smaller too that were part of the program and where they were. My understanding is that I didn't interview them actually for this project. Walmart is often featured, but where it was about measurement and transparency and then a lot of what a lot of what the suppliers were doing were actually these low-hanging fruits of packaging redesign, energy efficiency projects, food waste reductions, things that were really kind of low-hanging fruits. It's not about, kind of energy transformation or but because there's so many of them and scale is important, right? So those are just some thoughts, but I don't know.
Numbers.
Yeah.
Since they're not, like at least in the US.
Yeah.
They're not officially
Required,
or
yeah.
anything, like how much trust do you have?
Yeah. So CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, release these numbers, but so do quite a few other companies. I'm forgetting LCEG. I'm forgetting exactly what it stands for. It bought these various, like I think Thomson Reuters also had some numbers. So a lot of these various private companies that collect the information through publicly available data. And these are multinationals, right? So, and publicly owned. So it's easier to actually track their numbers versus like if they're private companies. But what I ended up doing was I triangulated. I didn't want to get into some common source errors and so I try to triangulate across sources, and that's how I am able to measure the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. I actually don't do a scope 3 emissions analysis. I wish I could, but it's just not, yeah, nobody can. It's not possible. So it's just scope 1 and scope 2. And there are, to some extent, there are some missing years, and there are ways where, my RAs collected some data, missing data. You could try to extrapolate from revenues, or yeah. So it is not easy for sure. I'm happy to also chat about some of the nitty-gritties of the equations too. I know, some there's maybe some interest there too.
Is that in the book or the appendix?
It's in the appendix. I also have some slides. I did not include them, thinking that perhaps it's more of an interdisciplinary audience, but I'm happy to pull them up if folks want to chat a little bit about that.
I think it's getting a little late.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Right, so, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm, really happy to be
Lily.
here. And
Let's not get our raffle here.
oh yes, yeah. We have a raffle.
Do you want to include people who are still on Zoom?
Yeah, sure. Are people interested in getting a copy of
Would they
Raise
be?
your hand if you're interested to be a part of the raffle.
And then we'll fill out
I'll do the tickets.
That's nice.
Raffle for the book.
Which is wonderful. I just got my PDF. Thanks to a million thanks for open access. And Lily, boy, you've earned your dinner tonight. Thank you for all that you've done for UCSC and all of us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So do I just put this ticket without the name?
Or if for those who are interested, maybe.
Just raise your hand.
Yeah, okay, so I think only one person raised their hand, so can you stick
Okay.
this to the.
Oh, there's two, Daniel and Robin,
Oh, yes.
and then now
Wait, wait.
and Jamila. I don't know. There's three. And yes, indeed, it's open access. So, when MIT Press approached me and asked if I would be interested in an open access edition, I was thrilled. I was like, yes, because I really am, excited about getting, just more folks, not just here in the US, but also even in developing countries and students and
Would you email the QR code so I can share with my students?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, let me actually, I'll email it to, yeah.
Just email me.
Okay, I'll email it.
Close your eyes.
Yes.
Very official here.
I only wrote down the name on the other one.
Oh, whoops, there's no name on this one.
That's okay, just read the number because I have the name.
Oh, you do? Okay, I'm sorry, I have to. 9033.
Robin.
Oh, okay.
Yay!
All right.
Okay, so Sandy, this is what we need to do for every subsequent Can Talk. We need to advertise a raffle. People will buy the
Yeah.
bushel basket.
Yeah, it's been kind of fun.
Leave the book with Andy or?
Yeah, I can get it to her.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you all very much. I've really enjoyed engaging with all of you.
Thank you, Lily. This was great.
So I think
I'm going to use your QR code. I don't want you to think I wasn't interested in the raffle, but.
yeah, this is the one for.
I'm going to.
Oh, Robin.
end the meeting.
Thank you, Robin.
And the Zoom now. Thank you all.